Characters of the Reformation, Part 7. James the First of England. James the First of England struck at the beginning of the 17th century the note which was henceforward to affect all modern life so profoundly. That note was the independence of nations, as lay societies, from the moral judgment of the Church. Henry IV of France, his contemporary, was the symbol, as we saw in the last chapter, of the fact that the Reformation would not be successful in its attempt to overwhelm our civilization. In France, after a furious struggle, in which the leaders of the nation had half of them gone Protestant and engaged in fierce civil wars against the other, the nation as a whole had come down on the right side of the hedge, mainly through the energy of the city of Paris. But in France also the new nationalist spirit was rising, and we shall see later what a height it reached under Louis XIV, Henry IV's grandson, before the end of the century. James I of England stands for that nationalist principle which, in the succeeding 300 years, completely conquered. Today, everyone, for the moment, accepts the principle that the nation is sovereign and lay, completely independent of every international control. The modern nation gives no obedience to any defined international moral authority, such as been the Catholic Church with the papacy for its supreme judge during all the centuries when our European civilization was being built up. The modern nation is not only completely independent, but admits no religious definition. Any citizen who prefers his allegiance to a religious body to his allegiance to the nation is regarded as a traitor. Religions of all kinds are regarded as the private affair of individuals. When the citizens differ amongst themselves upon religion, it is the duty of the state to keep the peace among them, but not to affirm itself the guardian of any one set of doctrines. The sacred thing to which everyone must adhere, the one doctrine against which no one may protest on pain of heresy, is the doctrine of patriotism and the right of the nation to its complete independence. There is, thus, no common law binding all nations. Such, undoubtedly, is the present situation of the white world, Europe and the extension of Europe on the American continent and in the various European colonies and dominions. How can this absolute nationalism will endure, no one can say. One can only be certain that it will not last indefinitely. Of its nature, it creates a state of affairs in which no nation, if it is strong enough to commit the crime, can be restrained from murdering another nation. There is no international police. Therefore, we have a state of affairs which is that of moral anarchy, mutually destructive, and, if it be pressed to its full conclusion, the absolute certain end of our civilization. Nationalism, then, is, for the moment, enthroned, and James I at the beginning of the 17th century, when the great boiling mass of the religious quarrel was beginning to crystallize into nations Protestant and Catholic, inaugurated the full practice of nationalism. Here it may be objected that the launching of this new doctrine, the first name of which was the divine right of kings, and the attempt to practice it was much older. For we must always remember that whether it is called the divine right of kings or the full independence of the nation, it comes, as we shall see in a moment, to exactly the same thing, expressing the same idea and having the same consequences. The first official and public statement of this sort was made by Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, at the coronation of little Edward VI, as early as 1547, 56 years before James I came to the English throne. The doctrine had been formally enunciated in a loud voice from the altar steps of Westminster Abbey in the sermon which Cranmer addressed to the little boy king on his enthronement. Cranmer reminded him that no power on earth could claim any rights over the King of England, and he said this, of course, as a direct challenge to the papacy. Hitherto, it had been admitted throughout Christendom that quarrels between Christian nations were subject to the general moral authority of the Church, and to ultimate appeal to the papacy in cases of specific dispute. In other words, Christendom had been regarded as one realm, of which the particular nations were only provinces, and a certain moral law and a certain visible organization were accepted as having common authority throughout. All the time between Cranmer's declaration and the accession of James I, the matter had remained in dispute. To one group of men throughout Europe, and much the larger group, the new doctrine appeared monstrous and revolutionary. By another serious, though much smaller, group it was clung to desperately and advanced upon every possible occasion. We all know how furiously the battle raged in England itself, and how, as late as 24 years after Cranmer's declaration, the Pope still claimed to release the de facto subjects of Queen Elizabeth from their allegiance de jure when he excommunicated that monarch. The point about James I is not that he began the thing, but that he inaugurated its full and undisputed practice. At the end of that generation, not quite 50 years later, it was accepted everywhere that the religion of a state must follow the religion of its government. At this point it is important to understand how this phrase, which sounds to us so quaint, the divine right of kings, is really identical with our most modern nationalist doctrine. In the time of James I, rather more than 300 years ago, men talked of the thing in terms of the rights of princes, that is, monarchs, rather than in terms of rights of nations. But it applied even then just as much to states in which there was no prince. It applied to an independent democratic republic like Geneva, or an aristocratic republic like Bern or Holland, or to any one of the free cities of Germany, whether these were governed by a few rich men or by public opinion. The operative word in the sentence is not king, but divine, and when people talked of divine right, they meant the right to govern with private responsibility to God alone, and not to any general organization of Christendom here on earth. James I himself made this perfectly clear in the speech which immediately followed his coronation. He claimed the right to call himself Catholic. The Church of England, of which he was now the head, uses that term in her formula and recites it, of course, in the fundamental creed generally called that of Nicaea. James underlined this point with all his might, intending by this emphasis to reconcile with his complete sovereignty, if that were possible, that half of his English subjects, that minority of his Scottish subjects, and that overwhelming majority of his Irish subjects, who were fully Catholic in tradition, practicing when they could, or, when they could not, demanding the Mass and the full functioning of the old religion. James did not at first desire to persecute that religion as William Cecil had done in the name of Elizabeth. What he did want was to get everyone to take the oath of allegiance, which declared him to be completely independent head of everything within his realm, clerical and lay. Therefore did he denounce with the utmost violence the claims of the papacy and directed all his policy against them. He called the Pope the three-headed beast, so that there should be no doubt about his attitude. He reiterated the claim that the crown of Great Britain was imperial, that is, subject to no lay state, and he concluded that it was not subject to any external moral authority either. It is interesting to note that James was, at one moment of his reign, in active negotiation with Rome, or rather with the agents of Rome, to see whether some formula could not be drawn up which would get over the difficulty of the oath of allegiance. If some set of words could be found which would satisfy the abstract papal claim to depose a monarch by relieving his subjects of their oath of allegiance, some form of words making quite clear that acceptation of, by all subjects, clerical or lay, of the full sovereignty of the monarchy and its freedom from any kind of moral superior international power, he would have been content. No such formula was found, but it is significant that he should have made such efforts to discover one after his violently open break with Rome. Many think of James I as a man steeped in Calvinism, because he had been brought up under the rules of the Scottish Kirk. This is a great error. He had indeed been brought up in the main under the rules of the Scottish Kirk, but during the earlier years of life, when character is formed, there was a struggle as to whether that religious organization or its opponent should get hold of him. His own mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had died because she was strongly Catholic, and because she represented the Catholic cause. And James himself always had a personal leaning, if not to the Catholic spirit, at least to Catholic individuals. His opposition to the Church was political rather than doctrinal. He prided himself on his learning, especially in theology, and it is only fair to admit that he did not pride himself without some cause. He was a very widely read man, and one of high culture, though of displeasing and probably vicious character. He regarded pretty well any tenet as debatable, save that one tenet which roused him to wrath, the supremacy of the Pope in moral matters, even over sovereign princes. It is impossible to say what would have happened in the way of Catholic toleration under James I, but for the action of that man of genius, Robert Cecil. He was the second of the Cecils who governed England. His father, William Cecil, had taken over the management of the country in 1559, trained his son Robert to statecraft, and was succeeded by that son without a break, although efforts were made in the transition of power from father to son to disrupt the succession by the introduction of new favorites. It was Robert Cecil controlling the government at the end of Elizabeth's reign, who had brought James to the throne, for the succession to Elizabeth was disputed, and the Queen herself had named nobody. James came into England from Scotland with little knowledge of English ways. He talked with so strong a Scottish accent that it was not easy to understand him, and he brought with him a group of Scottish companions highly unpopular in England. It must be remembered that Scotland had been the hereditary enemy of England for centuries, and was still regarded as an alien nation. James depended more and more upon this statesman, Robert Cecil, who not only had the very highest talents as a statesman, but was privy to all the secrets of the governing class around the king. He held firmly in hand a universal spy system and was adept, as his father had been, not only at discovering plots against the crown, but at creating them by the use of secret agents, and at nursing and fomenting them when they had started. Now it was Robert Cecil's prime object to prevent a Catholic reaction. The whole policy of his family and tradition was the gradual imposition, by force and trickery, of the new religion upon the English people. They had so far succeeded that, when James thus came to the throne in 1603, quite half the English were opposed to their ancient faith. Most of that were, no doubt, indifferent to religion, as were many on the other side also. But in 1603, quite half England was, upon the whole, anti-Catholic, and it was Robert Cecil's business to make all England anti-Catholic in time, or at any rate, if that should be impossible, to make so large a proportion of England anti-Catholic as to render the full return of the faith out of the question. Whether he invented the gunpowder plot or not will always be disputed. There is no positive proof that he did. All that we know for certain is that he knew all about it just after it was started, and nursed it carefully. Gunpowder was then a government monopoly, and yet the conspirators brought it openly across the Thames in large quantities, and all their movements were known. Cecil exposed the plot just at the right moment to produce the most effect, and it is from that date, 1606, that the tide turns and that England tends to become more and more a Protestant country. Cecil himself died rather early in James' reign, only half a dozen years after the great sensation of the gunpowder plot and the execution of the victims. But by that time his work was done. Catholics were hopelessly divided in England, and no longer the bulk of the nation. Meanwhile, James, for nearly 12 years in which he still had to live, hankered after toleration. What he wanted was not only a quiet realm, but a peacefully united one. He married his daughter to the very foolish Calvinist German elector Palatine, who tried to usurp the kingdom of Bohemia and fell into disaster thereby. But he did everything to marry his only surviving son, Charles, to one of the great Catholic reigning families. He failed to make the match with Spain, but succeeded in arranging one with the royal house of France. In the marriage treaty it was stipulated that Catholics in England should be free to practice their religion. He did what he could to prevent the butchery of priests, and, altogether, he was the originator of that Stuart policy of attempting religious truce, which is one of the chief accusations against that dynasty raised against them later by official historians. He and his son after him, and both his grandsons, Charles II and James II, all worked for toleration, not because they regarded religious toleration as a good thing in itself, but because they thought it good policy for the realm. However, above everything else in the eyes of James I, the complete independence of the English crown must be preserved, and it could only be preserved by supporting and continuing the Protestant policy of his predecessors. He stood for divine right. He watered and nourished that plant until it took firm root, and since his day has spread its doctrines everywhere, so that today, under another name, it is quite undisputed, with the consequences which we see around us. Ferdinand II. The Emperor Ferdinand II represents in the great religious struggle of the 17th century the strength of the Catholic reaction. That is what is generally called the Counter-Reformation. If he had only presented that, however, his partial success and partial failure would be less interesting than they are. He also represents another feature which had come into the struggle and strongly affected it everywhere: nationalism. Everywhere in Christendom, the particular interests of princes, cities, districts, nations, and even of races or groups of culture, were at issue with the general interests of united Christendom. One main aspect of the Reformation, therefore, is the effort of the religious revolutionaries to assert local independence politically against the authority superior to themselves, and ultimately, of course, against the supreme moral authority of the Church throughout Europe. It is convenient to call this force nationalism, because it was at its strongest where men's affection for their nation and their consequent desire for its complete independence was at work. But it was the same force even when there was no action concerned. It was the force which, for instance, had armed the Slavs of Bohemia against the great German landowners, the German dynasty which ruled them, the empire in which they formed a part. That had been the principal meaning of the Hussite heresy, and the wars which followed it in the century before Luther. In England, national feeling had also grown more than 100 years before the Reformation. It had been emphasized by the new use all over England of the English language. Until 100 years before the Reformation, the governing class in England was still speaking French, and this helped the cosmopolitan international feeling, and even therefore attachment to the Church's authority. Even until some years after the date 1400, for half a lifetime after Chaucer had begun to write, the most prominent men in England were still thinking, writing, and talking in French. For instance, William of Wykeham, the great founder of the new college at Oxford, though born in a small Hampshire town, hardly more than a village, and not a rich man, was French-speaking. But by the time of Joan of Arc, say around about 1430, English had become universal in all classes. The upper class no longer thought or spoke in French, and this powerfully added to the unity and the common feeling of the nation. Something of the same kind, a growth of separate national feeling, was going on in Spain, although there were several kingdoms there which only coalesced just before the Reformation took place. The same thing had happened in France. strong, united national feeling being apparent in that country at much the same time as it arose in England, though it was not quite so centralized, or so simple, or so coherent as it was in England. Now, in the case of the German Emperor and his empire, with their widespread and diverse territories, you could hardly talk of nationalism. But there was this strong particular feeling for the hereditary power of a particular family. The ancient libraries of the free cities, the independence is as large a measure as possible with everyone with territorial power, from the small village lord up to the duke or count of a whole province. Ferdinand II is a character who, after 100 years of religious division among Germans, undertakes to re-establish Catholicism everywhere in his domains, from the Alps to the Baltic, and from beyond the Rhine to the frontiers of Poland. He is the character who undertakes, as head of the German states, emperor over them all, and individually the possessor of the largest amount of land as a private prince, to undo what the Reformation had done in nearly the whole of North Germany, and partly in the center of Germany. Had Ferdinand II triumphed, the old religion would probably have been re-established, not only in Germany, but, sooner or later, in most of Europe. Nothing would have remained of the religious revolution save the small populations of Scandinavia, of England, and of Scotland, and no one can say how long these remnants could have stayed out, for there was a considerable Catholic minority in Scotland and in Scandinavia, and a very large one in England, as late as the beginning of Ferdinand's effort, that is from 1620 to 30. Even if England, Scotland, and Scandinavia had remained strongly independent Protestant governments, they would have accounted little compared with the vastly greater numbers and wealth of the German Empire, France, Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Poland. The Protestants all put together would not have commanded 1/10 of the men and money commanded by the Catholics, had Ferdinand succeeded in establishing a united Catholic German Empire. But in his effort to restore Catholicism universally, on the continent at least, Ferdinand II was also considering the power of his hereditary house, the House of Habsburg. And it was this duality of aim which was at bottom the cause of his partial failure. He succeeded to a great extent. To this day half the people who speak German are more or less Catholic, but he failed to sweep them all in. He had to end with a compromise which was completed after his death, and which from 10 to 11 years after that date left Germany permanently divided into two camps, Catholic and Protestant, which have never since joined. The reason he failed was that the French, under their great minister Richelieu, so feared an increase in the power of the House of Austria and the family of Habsburg, that though they were as a nation strongly opposed to the Reformation, and though they were led by a priest and cardinal, a great churchman, yet he and the nation which he governed were means to the preventing the Catholic success of Ferdinand. The French under Richelieu were not only frightened of Ferdinand II's success, but of the corresponding success of the other branch of the Habsburgs, the kings of Spain. The great emperor of the Reformation time, Charles V, had divided his immense dominions, which one may say covered practically the whole of western continental Europe, except France, and all the colonies of the New World except Brazil. He, as head of the Habsburg house, had, on his resignation, handed over to his brother, the German emperor, the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs themselves within that empire. The title, and, such as it was, the power attached to the empire with its seat at Vienna. But he put his son's family over Spain, the Netherlands, which today we call Holland and Belgium, the country of the Jura, certain Italian possessions, and, of course, all the new colonies on the American side of the Atlantic. The Spanish Empire, governed from Madrid, and the European Empire, governed from Vienna, were in the hands of two closely related branches of the House of Habsburg for much more than 100 years. The Spanish power helped the Emperor Ferdinand far more than if it had been a mere ally. They helped him with the whole strength of their crown, regarding his cause as their own. This means that the triumph of the Habsburg at Vienna would also have been the triumph of the Habsburgs at Madrid. The whole Western world would have fallen under the Habsburgs, for France was the only considerable independent continental power, and it was encircled by Habsburg territory upon every side. What today we call Belgium was in the hands of the Spanish House of Habsburg. The empire covered Luxembourg and Alsace, and the Jura Mountains. The same Spanish power lay everywhere south of the Pyrenees. There was only a short frontier of the Alps where an independent Italian principality made it an exception, and a very short distance on from the Alps, Spanish and Habsburg power began again in the northern Italian plains. It was on this account that Ferdinand's effort to restore Catholicism and undo the work of the Reformation lost its simple character and became complicated, not only with the national desire of the French especially, but of many small powers as well, to retain the independence against the Habsburgs. In spite of this complication, however, which ultimately mutilated Ferdinand's plan and left him and his successors only half victorious, his chances of victory were considerable. When he began his effort, in the year 1619, it was almost exactly 100 years after the Reformation had first broken out in his own Germany. His chances of success were moral rather than material. They consisted in the very widespread and increasingly popular reaction towards the old religion. In the first heat of the great religious quarrel, say from 1520 to about 1560, the rebellion against the old organization of society, including the religious authority of the Pope and the immemorial Catholic liturgy, was fiercely and increasingly successful. Those of the strong temper and greatest initiative were on that side, and there came to their aid a very powerful incentive, the opportunity of looting the wealth of the old church, which was enormous. And when the fury had spent itself, and when the main part of the looting had been accomplished, people woke up to the fact that what had been apparently no more than a generally confused and violent protest against corruption might well break up our civilization, and would certainly destroy the religion upon which that civilization was founded. Instinctively, therefore, the populace everywhere was beginning to move, in the last half of the 16th century, in reaction against the hitherto successful religious revolt. The movement was so powerfully aided by the establishment of the Jesuits, with their discipline and their complete singleness of aim, the most powerful factor in any moral effort. They sacrificed everything and they devoted everything to the restoration of religion. And within a lifetime they were educating the governing classes and the princes on all sides, recapturing whole districts by preaching and example and organized effort. Side by side with this went a great Franciscan effort in the same direction. This, and the success of the French crown and the French people in preventing Calvinism from sweeping France, started the advance of the Counter-Reformation and the strong personality of more than one pope, especially of St. Sixtus V, aided in the general success. Though the Counter-Reformation was in full swing and seemed likely to recapture morally all the ground that had been lost to Catholicism by the Protestant movement, the various German states which were nominally under the emperor and which counted actually as part of the empire lived under a compromise. The seizure of church lands and wealth by the Protestant princes, cities and local lords, was tolerated, and there was no serious, or at any rate no successful, repression of Protestant government in the regions controlled by these rebellious powers. When Ferdinand became emperor, already past his 40th year, he determined to put an end to this long drawn-out compromise. He demanded the restitution of the looted wealth of the Church. Not indeed of the whole of it, but so much as had been irregularly seized after the solemn engagements made in the middle of the 16th century, wherein those who began the looting promised they would go no further than they had already gone. Ferdinand demanded that what they had taken since that date, in defiance of the pact, should be handed back to the support of religion. It was always this financial demand, wherever it was made, which started the trouble. Exactly the same thing a few years later took place in Britain, when Charles I, on a much smaller scale, tried to get back some of the looted wealth of the Church in Scotland. That was the real root of the armed resistance which Charles had to meet and which ended in his defeat and death on the scaffold. It was Ferdinand's demand for restitution on a much larger scale in Germany which led to the armed conflict there. The particular event which started the main trouble was the quarrel over the government of Bohemia. The kingdom of Bohemia belonged by hereditary right to Ferdinand, and he had been accepted as king of Bohemia, according to that right, before he had become emperor. But certain of the magnates in Bohemia, notably Thurn, whose action in his country was exactly like the action of Orange in Holland, determined to rebel. They, or at any rate those who followed them, were not only moved by the fear of losing the wealth they had seized from the Catholic Church, but also by Slav feeling against the Germans, by national Bohemian feeling as well, and in some degree by the Protestant enthusiasm of a minority. They declared that the kingship of Bohemia was not hereditary but elective. They threw Ferdinand's representatives out of the window from the council chamber in Prague, and they invited the only Calvinist prince in Germany who governed the Palatinate, that is, roughly the region north of Alsace along the Rhine. to come into Bohemia and be called king, ousting the power of the legitimate King Ferdinand. This young Elector Palatine was a very foolish, vain man, unfitted for the almost impossible task to which he had been summoned. Yet he thought he could bring it off because he had the strength of the English government behind him, being the son-in-law of James I, and the sympathy of most of the German Protestants, and of course those elements in Bohemia which I spoke of, partly national, partly religious, partly financial. He went to Prague and was crowned king there, but Ferdinand easily reasserted his rights. Within a year, the Elector Palatine was not only driven out of Bohemia, but Ferdinand declared his own hereditary lands of the Palatinate confiscated for treason. The Catholic ruler of Bavaria closely acted with Ferdinand to secure this victory, and was rewarded by being given the Palatinate for his share, to be added to his hereditary Bavarian lands. The Spaniards also came in to help, and soon looked as though the struggle would be easily decided in favor of the new imperial scheme. Ferdinand had been challenged in the wrong way. His enemies had given him the best opportunities for success. Many of the Protestant German princes hesitated to continue the struggle against their emperor. The rebellious cities were on the whole more determined, and chief of them the very important city of Magdeburg, controlling the chief bridge across the Elbe in its lower part, where it forms the greatest military obstacle to any movement from the south against the north of Germany. The imperial arms in the war that was now being waged were superior to their opponents. In what way I shall describe later. They were almost certain to have won, but for the fact that at the critical moment, about a dozen years after Ferdinand had come to the throne, Richelieu, armed by the approaching triumph of the House of Habsburg in both its branches, had the perspicacity to hire one who had been told was a man of military genius. This man was the young Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, who had already engaged in hostilities on German soil upon the Protestant side. He was actually attacking his own cousin, the King of Poland, under conditions which I shall describe later on, when Richelieu approached him, and by raising his terms was ultimately able to buy the man's military genius, which he had appreciated with sure judgment. Richelieu did not himself declare war against the Habsburgs. He launched Gustavus Adolphus against them, and though that genius was only in the field against Ferdinand for a 12-month, his action in that brief time almost overset the Catholic cause, and did, in fact, in the long run prevent its full success. Ferdinand, after that check, lived on another half a dozen years, showing the utmost tenacity under disaster, meeting the most difficult and complicated circumstances of treason and further rebellion, and more or less restoring his own power, but not achieving what he had aimed at when he set out on the re-Catholicizing of Germany. He was compelled to give way on the capital point of the restitution of church goods. That, of course, was fatal. He began the struggle, as we have seen, in 1619. He kept it up for nearly 20 years until his death came in 1637. It was carried on after his death for another decade before it ended in exhaustion, with the two sides standing more or less as they had stood when the attempt began. The date 1648 may be taken as the final moment, after which there would be no question of Germany's being united again, either in one Protestant or in one Catholic state. If any man could have succeeded, it would have been Ferdinand. For not only had he the highest courage and the fullest tenacity of purpose, but also the greatest devotion to religion and the finest personal character. He had, besides, what is of supreme value in governing men, sympathy with the masses and the humblest of his people. Anyone could approach him at any time. The population of his hereditary dominions was by that time of his death firmly bound to him with the bond of real affection. But that fatal complication of Habsburg ambition, dreaded by France, and by all states and cities which it menaced, had come in to prevent the great experiment from succeeding. Nevertheless, Ferdinand, when he came to die, might say what most men say, who have attempted something perfect, failed to achieve it, yet partially succeeded. He could say, like one of his descendants, Maria Theresa, there are no complete satisfactions. He had, at any rate for the moment, saved the empire. Richelieu and his Protestant allies accomplished their object in breaking the dominant power of the House of Habsburg. By forcing of arms they had saved France from the fear of Ferdinand's rapidly growing influence, but they had dealt a shattering blow to the unity of the Catholic forces of Europe. The resistance to Ferdinand had cost the German people a fearful price. This struggle, known in history as the 30 Years' War, dating from the first revolts in Prague, 1618, to the final peace in 1648, hugely impoverished the Germans, diminished their numbers to perhaps half of what they had been, left their commercial cities in ruins or crippled, and all hope of unity among them destroyed. From the time of its termination, the Germans remained divided amongst themselves, and the French power rose to its greatest height.